For more on this story, we joined via Skype by political analyst David Owiro. Mr. Owiro, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Kenya seems to be quite skeptical about a potential trade deal with China. Do you share in their apprehension? David Owiro, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, I can hear you. Certainly, to your question, there's a genuine concern from African nations, just like Kenya, simply because of the large trade imbalance that exists between most economies in Africa and China. And the fear of course, if there were to be a free trade agreement between an African nation such as Kenya and China, then it would sort of result in increased imports. And so the assuasion from the Kenyan authorities, from Ministry of Trade, for it to be more modeled around the AGOA framework, such that we see China as a developed country actually providing opportunities for countries such as Kenya to participate and to be empowered through such a framework, is perhaps much more beneficial than having a free trade area. And so I do understand the sentiments from the Kenyan authorities.
Yeah, I mean, East African countries, including Kenya, borrowed billions of dollars from China as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, this essentially gives China the necessary carte blanche to have its way in the East African community, in particular Kenya. Can they say no to what China wants?
Well, we know the support that China has given in East African communities and the member countries, particularly in upgrading the railway infrastructure and port infrastructure, is very key to addressing the large infrastructure gap that exists not only in East Africa but also in Africa. And this goes towards, addressing or trying to increase intra-African trade, and achieve this industrialization dream that most African countries have. But really, that doesn't give China a guarantee or a right to have its way, regarding the kind of aspiration it has with regards to trade. I think what it points to is perhaps a partner that is willing to cement and further build on the cooperation that already exists, so that they can, at least try and increase also the trade in goods and trade services levels that beyond the pre-existing ones that exist at the moment.
Will there be any reciprocity should this potential trade deal see the light of day? I mean, Nairobi, or rather Kenya, has imported goods worth $3.67 billion from China last year, while exporting just 11.32 billion shillings in goods to China. Now, Nairobi wants to export more goods to China, but this hasn't been happening.
Yes, certainly. We know one of the major challenges, especially when you're talking about an export orientation that is primarily based on raw commodity products such as agriculture and the like. The non-trade barriers and the standards issues that often crop up because when you're talking about exporting, say, vegetables or fruits, you often have to meet certain standards of the importing country, but also just global standards and practices. And, the producers in Africa certainly are not able to, produce these products at that level. And so there certainly has to be some hand-holding in terms of exchange of appropriate technologies so that we can be able to meet those standards requirements. But also beyond that, for, big partners such as big giants, economic giants such as China to sort of take a keen approach in actually helping their partners in Africa to develop that capacity so that they're able to meet, the export destination requirements around standards and so forth.
David, am I correct to say that since Kenya is a regional powerhouse in the East African community, whatever it decides or whatever it agrees on with China will filter down to its East African neighbors or counterparts?
There is some semblance of, I would say, a cascade of policies that would follow to the East African community members. But remember that much as we have an EAC, East African community that is very vibrant, the undertakings are still by the national economy. And so perhaps best experiences and best lessons can then be borrowed and applied by other member countries if they do so wish. But certainly there's no, they're not compelled to implement, treaties and agreements as per their name. But also you have to note that if you look at the recent developments in the EAC, the political dynamic has been quite different, and there has been challenges where we see agreements at the East African level are not complied with wholly by member states. And these examples that come to mind are Tanzania, for instance, not fully implementing some of the agreements that have been agreed at the regional level. And so I am not too optimistic in terms of the region being able to follow through if this does indeed happen between Kenya and China. But what I know is that there is some semblance of regional policy cohesion that member states do in fact aspire to, and that might result in some cascading of such policies. It does indeed happen.
Kenya seeks a trade deal that is modeled on the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, which allows African exports like apparel and textiles duty-free access to United States market. Now, we know the trade tensions between the United States and China. Would China be able to, channel whatever trade deal along the same route as AGOA?
I think it's possible because if you look at the WTO, which is the multilateral trading framework, which all participating countries or member countries do adhere to. Actually, there's a principle of divergent interest, basically allowing member states of the WTO to enter into agreements with more advanced nations that are disproportionate, recognizing the different economic bases and the development stages that these member states come from. And so that differentiation can indeed be articulated within a trade framework such as the AGOA. And so for China's case, and indeed there's already some political willingness in this case because we see through various initiatives such as the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, where China has indeed gone to a large extent to provide support for African-based economies, not only to upgrade the infrastructure, but also towards security, investment, as well as the modernization of agriculture and also providing some business-to-business link. And so for me, I remain fairly optimistic that having a deal between African members, African countries and China modeled around AGOA is indeed possible.
Now, David, we don't have much time, unfortunately, but I've been getting reports that Huawei strengthens foothold in Africa to offset U.S. ban. Do you think this could have perhaps inspired China to be more aggressive in their approach to be wanting trade deals with East African countries?
I think certainly there is that indication that China is very keen to support Africa's development priorities in line with Africa's Agenda 2063. And one of the key priorities is technological advancement, particularly in e-commerce and the like. And so alongside the promises that China has always made at the FOCAC meetings, for instance, the FOCAC in 2018, one was to establish business-to-business links and provide dedicated funds to support those kind of linkages. And so for me, I would see the entry and the signing of this landmark deal between Huawei and the African Union as being just one of those business-to-business links that China is keen to foster.
All right, David, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. That was David Owiro. He's an independent consultant and analyst of economic and political affairs of Africa. This is The Globe.